the adhesive's brittleness, the tiny hairline fracture at the corner where the ivory met the wood. I thought with a strange clarity that mending a key and mending a relationship required the same patience. One step at a time, a measured pressure, a waiting for the give to settle into a new kind of strength. Outside the window, someone hammered at a broken fence. The city was, as always, making and remaking itself. At the far end of the bench a ticket stub I had once found in Alyssa's hand sat under my thumb. It was folded exactly as she had left it, soft with time. I did not open it. Some things must remain folded until the hand that unfolds them is willing to be changed by the thing it reveals. That night I had closed a lid and the sound had damaged more than wood. It had made visible the ways people want to narrate loss. In the coming days there would be offers, threats, and bargains. For now, I steadied the key in my palm and prepared the glue. The work continued slow, precise, and humble. A lesson, perhaps, in how to hold a memory without becoming its jailer. Outside the workshop, the city kept talking. Inside, I resolved to teach Luca how to listen and, more importantly, how to wait. The future of our work would depend less on the notes we could summon and more on the agreements we made about when those notes could be heard. It was a small and necessary covenant. To whom did we owe fidelity, and when could the city's appetite be satisfied without devouring the thing it desired? I had no definitive answer. I only had a new, urgent sense that the practice of repair must contain within it the ethic of reticence. At dusk, as I fitted the key back into its place with a gentleness that felt like apology, the phone of the municipal registrar rang once in the street and then stopped. Someone else had decided that it would be better to act than to argue. The sound of it, though small, felt to me like the first insect flutter of a coming storm. I pressed the key and let the tone bloom and die quietly in the air, not for an audience but for the piece of wood itself. It was a private note, and I kept it so. Yet even as I shut the lid and locked the door, a thought nagged at me: silence can be a kind of hoarding. The next battle would be how to move between those extremes. I did not yet know how. But I knew one thing: the public ear, once made aware of a private pulse, will not rest. And the difficulty of our work was not only to make instruments speak again, but to guard what they spoke in the right way. The meeting had shown me how fragile that guard was. It had also shown how desperately people wanted to be part of something that might bind them to what had been lost. The problem was that wanting to be bound often translated into wanting to bind. When the night finally folded around the quarter, and the stars overhead were only thin holes in a shuttered sky, I lay awake thinking of the meeting's small rupture and of Luca's eager hands. I resolved to teach him restraint as patiently as I had taught him to seat a pin. If he learned the lesson, we might yet mend what he had loosened. If he did not, our work would be in constant danger of being consumed by the very audience we sought to educate. The next morning would bring new conversations, and perhaps a renewed attempt to show what we had done to a world that wanted simple answers. I thought of Eliza's injunction not to become a monument, and I tasted in the back of my mouth the bitter tang of that terrible truth: to preserve is sometimes to possess, and possession is always a temptation. There are hours in the night when the workshop feels exactly like a buried room, the tools arranged like bones, the dust lying in the angles of drawers as if in testimony. I have always liked the way the nails of a bench let light fall through them, the way a tuning hammer balances in my palm like an answer. After the meeting in the square, after Luca's ill-fated demonstration and Marta's measured curiosity, I came home and closed the door to the street. The clatter of plates and the murmuring of neighbors receded, and the room of rescued wood and scuffed keys took me in as if it were a patient waiting for a stitch. I did not mean to exile myself. The word itself sits badly in my mouth, as if to say that I have been sentenced for a crime I did not wholly understand. I spent the first nights watching the windows of the workshop, the glass dull with ash, waiting for the lights of officials to appear, for Victor's clerk to arrive with a list and an officious smile. Instead, the nights were mostly quiet, filled with the small sounds of the things I keep, the soft rasp of sandpaper, the brittle click of a metronome in need of oil, the steady, untroubled respiration of the city as people who had survived managed their small consolations in rooms 3 streets over. I slept in fits, if at all. My bench became a bed of sorts, my coat a blanket. I would wake cold with the memory of Ellis's hand, or with a phantom pulse that the repaired keys had taught me to hear. Sometimes I would think, absurdly, that if I let the workshop stand long enough in its own dark it would remember her for me. It was perhaps that compulsion that made me begin the list. The inventory began as a catalogue for myself and became, quickly, a talisman. I gathered paper and an old fountain pen, the nib smeared with dried varnish, and I began to name the instruments I would not surrender. Not every piano, not every upright pressed back into the municipal registry. There was a specificity to my refusal. Some of the pianos were public property by rights that could be argued, but property is a brittle definition when measured against the tenderness of a repaired key. I wrote, the Salon Grand from Korowski Street found beneath a collapsed beam. The 4th key from the left, when repaired, played the first heartbeat, 3 quick, then 2 long. I wrote until the ink ran low, then dipped again, and for each instrument I recorded the room from which it had come. The smell that rose when I opened its belly, stale figs in one, disinfectant and old perfume in another, the exact place where a ribbon or a hidden ticket had lodged. It was not merely catalogue, it was a map of intimacy. The act of listing made me both steadier and more fevered. I felt, as I wrote, the small authority of naming. Perhaps that nation's bureaucrats believed possession was literal. I knew better by now. Memory lives in gestures and in the way a string is coaxed, and once you have given voice to a particular note, you cannot pretend it is not present. To write each instrument's particulars was to claim responsibility for what it carried. To make a document was to become, in some measure, a steward. Frida found me like that one morning, the ink still wet on the pages, a cup of cold tea congealing beside me. She stood in the doorway with her usual economy, no sudden entrance, no theatrical demands, and a parcel wrapped in mottled paper. Her eyes took in the room not with accusation, but with a steadied concern I have come to need. You don't look like a man who sleeps, she said, the inflection casual, almost an accusation of the world rather than of me. I shrugged. It is a poor defense. I gestured at the stool. I have things to do. She set the parcel on the workbench and unwrapped it as if she were unfolding a map. Inside lay a loaf of bread still warm, a small pot of jam, and a thermos of tea that steamed faintly. Frida's hands moved with the same efficiency she used to mend my shirts. She took the torn strap of an old metronome, a relic I had kept for reasons I did not yet understand, and began to stitch it with a thick thread as if she were sewing together a seam that had been threatening to come undone for years. You look after the keys, she said. I look after the strings of the day. You cannot be a surgeon on an empty stomach. Not even a poor one. Her voice was matter of fact. There was no pity in it. Instead, it carried the kind of reasoning that had kept us going during the worst ration months. Do the small tasks, and the rest may follow. I watched her cut the thread, the motion so practiced it seemed to me the choreography of survival. We ate in silence for a time. I unfolded the page and began to read aloud what I had written the night before, the list of instruments and the faint code name I had given each: the salon, the courtyard, the child's upright. The way the words left my mouth transformed them, altered them from a private talisman into a sequence of sounds that required response. Frida listened, and then, when I stopped, she said, "Do you know why you must not be too public with this?" She did not mean the bureaucrats. She meant something older. Because once you give grief a public address, it becomes someone else's business, she said, and put the fork down with a slight tap. You know what people do with things they can point to, Anton. They'll make a sign, a plaque. They'll tell a tidy story so the wound looks like progress. They will forget the small cruelties. Her hands, dipped in flour from an earlier task, closed around the bread. But you must also know that you cannot live entirely inside these things. You will not be well if you try. I thought of Elise, of the way she would rehearse a phrase until it sat in a certain place of her body, of how she would adjust tiny details in a score until the meaning felt precise. Frida's words felt to me like the underside of that practice, a humility about wounds. When Luca came later that afternoon, he was carrying a small lamp and a box of bits, pins, rivets, mismatched ivory that someone had traded for. He moved differently now, less light-footed than during his first days, as if the city and the scandal had ground some edges from him. He set his box down and looked around the workshop as if measuring its boundaries. "You didn't answer my letters," he said, half reproach, half relief. I had written nothing to him. My silence had been a kind of language, a refusal, a protection, an attempt not to entangle him in a grief that had become performative for others and which I wanted to keep private. He sat at the opposite end of the bench and began to sort the contents of his box with a care that betrayed his practical instinct. "I tried to put right what happened," he said quietly. "I thought maybe if people saw the bench, the marks, the ribbon, they'd understand. I wanted to prove we weren't lying." He pulled from the box a small fragment of ivory, its edge file scraped. He turned it in his hands and then, impulsively, he placed it on the surface of the bench where my scribbled chart still lay. The impulse in him was honest, but it was a different kind of honesty, one that sought affirmation from outside. He wanted the story told and his role acknowledged. He wanted to be part of a recovery he could point to and call his own. I felt both irritated and protective, because his yearning was less guarded than mine, and because in it I saw my younger self's hunger for a public ledger of survival. "You can't prove what you feel," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You can only show what you have done. Proof is for the law. Memory is for your bones." The words felt both truer and more evasive than I intended. Luca's face shifted. "So we hide it all?" he asked. "You keep these and we simply what? Keep them for ourselves?" I did not answer immediately. Instead, I walked him through the instruments I had marked not for registry. I told him where each had been found, what small smell had accompanied its opening, which key had first given Elise's pulse. I tried to make the facts precise so that his hunger for a public truth might become, at least in part, an apprenticeship in the ethics of restraint. He listened. That did not make him less restless. He still wanted to photograph the bench, to file, to label. He still wanted certainty. But he stood for a long time at the bench as if the room's quiet had its own gravity. Finally he said, simply, "Teach me to be careful then. Teach me how not to take." That is the promise appropriate for a workshop, to pass on not only the craft of repair but the craft of withholding. It is an odd virtue, not often listed in manuals. Evenings in exile make memory more vivid than daylight. The lamplight throws exaggerated angles. The small harp of shadows that gather on the floorboards make certain places seem deeper than they are. I took to closing the shutters partly to keep light from the street and partly to measure the intensity of a note against a private darkness. In that darkness sounds rearranged themselves. A key struck at midnight might act like a summons, and I would answer by finding the exact string I had mended months earlier. On the fourth night, Frida insisted on a ritual of a different sort. She brought with her one of Alyssa's old scarves. Someone had found it in a pile and recognized the pattern, and she laid it on the bench beside the list. "This will not help you keep her whole," she said, "but it will keep your hands from rubbing at the seam of your grief constantly. Put it on the bench so you do not mistake everything you touch for a relic." There was a shrewdness in her attempt to domesticize the extraordinary. It was not cynicism. It was a practical understanding that even grief needs boundaries. I did as she asked and draped the scarf across the bench. The fabric smelled faintly of soap and thyme. The move made the room feel more measured, less a shrine than a place of work with a morning corner prescribed. The next morning I found, tucked beneath the scarf, a piece of paper that Elise might have recognized, a bar of music, a fragment she had once used as an exercise. The notation was not in her hand, but the paper had been folded so delicately it suggested someone had pressed it into being in an old habit. I held the scrap to the light. There was dust in the fold, and a faint seam along the corner, like a healed wound. The discovery unsettled me. It suggested that even in refuge there are intrusions. The past insists itself upon the present in ways both consoling and cruel. I had come to the workshop to be alone with my work and my memories, but memory is a social thing. Even in absence, Elise had friends who would allow fragments of her to remain in circulation. Enya, perhaps, who sewed things anew better than anyone the economy of salvaged cloth. I imagined her, large-hipped and relentless, pressing a scrap into my hands with a sharpness that disguised tenderness. It was Enya who came later, bringing a handful of leftover music scraps from which she was making another patch for her curtain. She moved as if the streets had not been recently cleansed of feverish debate, but rather as if the routine of trade had never been interrupted. Her arrival felt like a balm because she is a person who knows how to sew together contradiction. "You are in exile," she teased as she set down a bundle of half-mended sheets on my table. "Self-imposed," I admitted. She sat and began to stitch with the old, practical rhythm that a tailor has eyes on what she does, hands moving like punctuation. "You cannot keep everything and still breathe out. You know that, but perhaps there are certain things that must be kept where they can be read by only one pair of hands. That is a kind of kindness. Not to the dead, to the living." Her voice carried the blunt wisdom of tradespeople. She thinks of mending less as memory than as social glue. Her idea of hiding tokens inside stitches was not merely craftiness but a moral maneuver, something that would allow memory to exist without being turned into commodity. We spent the afternoon talking of small things. She asked about my list, asked to see where the bench scratches marked certain repair events. I let her read. When she reached the line where I had noted the ticket stub and the brittle ribbon, she did not look surprised. Instead, she whispered, "Then it is not only you who listens. The keys remember you too. There is in that thought a freedom. Objects that keep traces of a voice do not belong to any single mourner. They function like the bones of a story where several people can touch and trace, where memory is not reduced to a museum label." But the world outside my shutters continued to move with its appetite for tidy narratives. The municipal notices still hung in the market square. A man with a neat suit still crossed my gaze sometimes in the marketplace and smiled with the kind of certainty that bruises. "Victor will be patient. Bureaucratic patience is a sort of weapon. He will wait until fatigue makes my hand slack, until the cost of keeping items in secret becomes intolerable. He will, in time, ask for papers and receipts and a registry of provenance. The law will not recognize a memory practiced in private hands. For now, I have a list and a scarf and the company of people who fold grief into habit. I have Luca, who is learning to see that the craft is not only about gluing a broken key, but about deciding which keys to leave unexposed. I have Frida, who will not allow me to starve for the sake of a private liturgy. I have Enya, who will find places to hide these small tokens inside a communal curtain so they may be both sheltered and shared. And I have the pianos themselves, patient and indifferent in their wood and wire, their voices waiting for me to coax them out. At night, I sit at the bench and find the rhythm of the work again. A hammered pin beds a key. A touch of hide glue sets with the slow patience of a vow. The sounds I coax now are quieter, less private in one sense and more intimate in another, measured rehearsals of the notes that have followed me like a shadow. I do not play the full map. I am learning restraint, the modest art of leaving things unexhibited. I press a key and listen, and the sound that emerges is as close as I will allow to a confession. It is less a proclamation than a conversation. The exile is not a punishment. It is a condition of care. Outside, the city prepares its spectacles. Inside, we practice the etiquette of loss. The two cannot coexist without friction. Already, the friction shows itself in the guarded faces of some neighbors, in the furtive question of Marta's latest piece, in an official who lingers too long at the corner of my street. I expect Victor's patience to be the patience of a river that will, in time, erode even the hardiest stone. At the end of the week, as the lamp guttered and the ink dried on another page of my list, I closed the ledger and turned off the light. Frida's scarf lay folded on the bench like a cordoned-off place. Outside, a distant truck rolled along the broken avenue. Inside, the keys slept in their rows. I touched the fourth key from the left on the Salon Grand and did not play it. I only rested my fingers there, as if to remember the shape of a pulse, without calling it back into sound. There is a small, private hope that perhaps the work of repair will teach me how to keep someone alive without enclosing them in glass. It is a hope with modest needs, the slow patience of glue as it dries, the careful designation of which instruments will be saved from exposition, the presence of friends who can stitch and cook and hold. The city will ask for spectacle. I will try to teach it restraint. And yet, even as I tell myself this, I am aware that nothing lasts intact forever. The law is persistent. The story of recovery is a hungry thing. The inventory I have written is a flask against thirst, but it may not be a shield. Tomorrow we will continue with the small, ordinary work, a broken jack to be refitted, a string to be replaced, a key to be aligned. We will keep the lamps trimmed. We will measure our hands by the contour of wood. We will practice the fragile art of touching. In exile, we have made a new kind of attendance. It is not splendid and it will not be printed on posters. It is the daily, quiet fidelity of acts, mending, counting, keeping the small rituals of food and talk. It is the recognition that the work itself can be a form of prayer. As I closed the shutters and heard the distant murmur of some late radio, I felt the first soft uncoiling of what might become endurance. It will not be spectacle. It will be something harder and more useful, the insistence on tending. The hook that tugs at the end of the night is not dramatic, not a revelation of state theft or sudden confession. It is quieter, a note I found the week before in a piano I had decided to shelter, a note Elise had once hummed into the wood. I promised myself I would not play it in public. I promised myself I would not make it into a map for others. The promise holds for the moment, but the city will soon announce another event. Victor will be patient, and patience, from a man like him, will eventually demand a reckoning. For now I will keep to the bench and the list, and I will try to learn how to honor memory without making of it a museum. Tomorrow, someone will knock. The notice arrived pinned beneath the bolt of my door, as if the city had chosen to affix itself to the hinge of my life. It was a single sheet of gray paper, the municipal letterhead printed with sober pride, creased where a bureaucrat's fingers had folded it to fit a pocket. Sasha Rukov had handed it to me with an apologetic look. She lingered long enough for the apology to be unnecessary. "They want to ask you to consider," she started, then stopped as if the phrasing mattered. The paper said less and implied everything. A commemorative concert, to be held in 2 months' time. A list of instruments to be included. A request for the participation of local restorers. Underneath that, in a smaller font and with less ceremony, the name of my piano appeared. My piano. The grand I had raised from the wreckage of a collapsed salon. The instrument whose cedar belly had held a ribbon in Alyssa's hand. Whose fractured key had first sighed back that pulse I could not admit to anyone. Victor Haller's office had circled it with the calm certainty of a man arranging a parade. I read the notice 3 times before I let it fall into my lap. The paper folded like a small bureaucratic lung. The city, which had insisted until now that it had no time for sentiment, had thought better of its image, a rebuilt concert hall, a sequence of restored instruments. A program that would show recovery as a matter of civic competence. Victor Haller had decided the city's story needed an instrument that could be measured on the ledger of reconstruction. I felt, with a kind of private dismay, that my little workshop had been admitted to an inventory it had not asked to join. Luca found me at the workbench, my thumb in a groove on the rim of the Grand's action, as if to test for the note of a pulse. He had a box of replacement pins under his arm and the bright, impatient energy of somebody who believed that exposure was the same as justice. "They sent someone to Frida too," he said. "She kept her mouth shut, but Anton, this could be good. Imagine the funding. We could get a proper roof for the shop." I should have rejoiced. I did not. I thought instead of the ribbon I had found inside the grand's frame, a fold of tape, a sliver of hair, a ticket stub with Alyssa's tiny, precise handwriting. Those objects were not merely evidence. They were clauses in a private grammar. To present the instrument on a stage was to suspend that grammar in glass and light, where anyone could misread its syntax. "They're asking you to play," Luca added, as if that detail required no moral weight. "They want the instrument to demonstrate renewal. They want the restorer there." They said your name. For a moment I considered the absurdity of my own attachment. A musician, me, who had once imagined the conservatory's quiet galleries as cathedrals, now had the city's attention, because an instrument had remembered a heartbeat. It was at once an honor and a violation. I went to Victor's office, because I thought refusal would be an insolent privacy, and that I might be able to frame a response, to offer the instrument to the city, but to preserve, in the performance, what was necessary of discretion. I had practiced similar negotiations with other men of tidy speech and tidy appetites, men who believed the past could be folded into a headline. Victor greeted me in a room that smelled faintly of lemon oil and white glue. His suit was the same sober blue I had always seen him in, his left eye twitching slightly as he evaluated me by some civic metric I could not name. "Anton Valak," he said, the syllables trimmed precisely. "Please, sit." I took the chair by the window, where the light skittered across municipal pamphlets like a frightened thing. Victor clasped his hands as if closing a ledger. "This is an important moment for the city. We must show that we've been able to restore not only walls and roofs, but what makes us human. Music is that statement." "Your work has been noted." "Noted," I echoed. It was an odd verb for the thing that had kept me awake at nights, the thing that had taught me the difference between two nearly identical varnishes. Victor's noted felt like an entry. "We would like the grand," he continued. "We would like you to perform a brief program. Of course, it will be framed," he used the word with the neatness of someone describing a painting to be hung, "within a larger repertoire. This is not merely an exhibition of repair. It's a public act of confidence. The restored instrument will be placed center stage. Your participation will lend the program authenticity. There are ways of speaking that dissolve particulars into the abstract." Victor was fluent in them. He spoke of public acts and confidence as if grief were a civic object that could be polished and returned in time for a ceremony. "Why me?" I asked. "There are other restorers." He smiled the smile of a man who knows his leverage. "Because it is your instrument. Because the people will understand that a person who has labored on something is the best advocate for it. Because your story, no offense, Anton adds a human line to the narrative. People respond to stories." "You mean my grief." "Your dedication," he corrected. "They're the same, in some sense." I left with a promise that was both invitation and demand. Victor did not say the word confiscate. That would have been gauche. He spoke of loan agreements and insurance protocols and the city's careful stewardship. The municipal language was an opiate. It smoothed the edges of coercion. In the street I found Marta waiting. She had heard that the municipal machine was looking for notable pieces and had come to see what I would do. She took my hand as if I were an informant of some private reverie. There was no judgment in her pressure, only curiosity, her own way of doing the work of repair. "Are you going to play?" she asked. Her voice was low, almost solicitous. "They asked me to consider it," I said, "and am considering," I said, which was neither yes nor no. Marta's eyes, always quick and kindly, registered that there was more. "People will need a shape for this grief," she said. "They don't know how to look at ruins without a script. If you refuse, someone else will write that script." Her words were true and unsatisfying. The danger was not only that someone else would narrate the past. The danger was that the past would be simplified into a visually satisfying sequence. A cut scene of collapse followed by a neat montage of hands smoothing varnish. The heartbeat notes would become an anecdote. That night I sat at the bench long after Luca had left and after Frida had carried her flattened bowl of soup back to the kitchen. The workshop felt like an organ. The grand's lid, still half open from a tuning, reflected a thin band of light like a wound. I ran my fingers down the line of keys. Each repaired key made its small claim. Each small